Dota 2 is a game played 5 versus 5, but often smaller pairs find themselves within teams. Tiny and Io. Together they form an iconic duo from the early years of Dota 2, a force of terror that tormented pub games and pro Dota alike. Then, Tiny was reworked and has continued to dominate the competitive scene. At least that's how the tale goes. But is that true, or is there more left untold? Today we will delve into Dota history and investigate Tiny's story and performance at the most important Dota 2 events, the International Tournament Series. So, how good was Tiny, the Stone Giant? The story of Tiny is brought to you by Honkai Star Rail. Honkai Star Rail is a new and already very popular RPG from Hoyo Wars, the makers of Genshin Impact. If you're familiar with Genshin, then you already know that Honkai Star Rail is full of charming characters with unique personalities. The game is available for free on PC, mobile, and now also on PS5. And cross-platform play is supported for all of those platforms. Honkai Star Rail just released update 1.4, which introduces a whole new storyline and 2 new characters. First, we've got Jing Liu, who is a crystal maiden with a sword. She stabs people and then freezes them to death. She's very much a DPS-centric character for us filthy carry players that like dealing a lot of damage. Next are Topaz and Numbi, a duo character centered around fire. Topaz is, and I believe I'm reading this correctly, an accomplished director of business. And I'm not really sure what Numbi is, but it's cute and I would die for it. Honkai Star Rail version 1.4 has a lot of new content with additional storylines, maps and the start of the Ethereum Wars, where you can make your favorite monster fight against other monsters. Try out Honkai Star Rail at the link down below. You will also find a code there that you can use to unlock 50 additional Stellar Jade, and if you log in for 10 days in a row, you can get 10 free Star Rail special passes. Thank you very much to Honkai Star Rail for sponsoring this video. Tiny was implemented into Dota 2 during the closed beta period before the first international. Let me tell you about his attributes and abilities at the time. Tiny was a melee strength hero with remarkably high starting damage and strength. Opposing this were his low agility, armor, and movement speed. Tiny's first ability was Avalanche. It threw an avalanche of rocks at the target location. The rocks needed half a second to arrive and then stunned and dealt damage to enemies hit by them. While a half-second delay may not sound significant due to its rather small radius, Tiny still needed to be careful when placing Avalanche. When it connected, it was a fantastic ability. Avalanche was a stun and did good damage. As silly as it sounds, that has remained the gold standard for abilities to this very day. Toss was Tiny's second ability. Toss allowed Tiny to grab a random unit in a small radius around himself and then throw them. A unit thrown this way needed to be thrown to a unit. This could be another opponent, an ally, a creep, or even the tossed unit itself, in which case they would simply be thrown up into the air and then fall down again. While the tossed unit was in the air, they were stunned, and when they landed, they would deal damage to all enemy units in a small AoE. Tiny could toss any unit, including allies, but only opponents took the landing damage. If the tossed unit was an opponent, they also took 20% bonus damage. Toss also dealt 33% of its damage to towers. It couldn't affect them directly, as Tiny couldn't toss a unit at a tower, but if a tossed unit landed near a tower, that tower would be damaged. Toss was an ability with endless uses. Tiny could use it as a simple stun, or to toss an ally at his opponents to initiate fights, or to toss opponents away from his allies to protect them. Toss was an ability that allowed Tiny players to use their creativity to find opportunities for all sorts of shenanigans. It was a fantastic ability that was strengthened even further by its synergy with Avalanche. Avalanche and Toss had an interesting interaction when used together. Enemy units affected by Toss and Avalanche at the same time got hit twice by Avalanche's damage. As long as Tiny managed to isolate an opponent to guarantee they would be the one tossed, and then cast Avalanche and Toss in rapid succession, he could deal around 1000 burst magic damage. This came at the cost of not using the spells individually and maximizing their stun duration. But death is the strongest stun, so it was often worth going for the Toss Avalanche combo. Tiny's third ability was Craggy Exterior. Craggy Exterior was a passive ability that gave Tiny a chance to stun enemy units that initiated an attack on him. For Craggy to trigger, Tiny did not need to get hit. Instead, it could trigger as soon as an attack was started against him, and it would interrupt that attack. Craggy could trigger on both ranged and melee heroes, but only if they were in a 300 radius around Tiny. In practice, this often restricted it to working on melee heroes only. Craggy also dealt a small bit of magic damage whenever it triggered, and it passively provided Tiny with bonus armor. This armor bonus was actually quite relevant, as Tiny's low natural agility left him otherwise vulnerable to physical damage. Tiny's ultimate was Grow. Grow was a passive ability that gave Tiny bonus damage, movement speed, and increased the bonus damage that Toss did to an opponent that was thrown. Grow also reduced Tiny's attack speed. This loss was fairly minor when compared to the additional damage Tiny got from the ability, and so it wasn't a big hindrance. It mostly meant that Tiny had to build attack speed if he wanted to become an attack-based carry. But even without that lofty goal, Grow always gave Tiny the option of hitting for a lot of damage with even just 1 or 2 attacks. The damage provided by Grow was base damage. A hero's damage was made up of base damage and bonus damage. Base damage was the white damage number, while bonus damage was the green number. Base damage was usually limited to a hero's starting damage and their primary attribute. Grow providing specifically base damage was unusual and beneficial, as various effects in Dota cared about base damage. For example, Vengeful Spirit's aura enhanced the damage of allied heroes, but that enhancement depended on their base damage. Similarly, illusions only used base damage to calculate their own attack damage. Finally, when Tiny leveled up Grow, he would get bigger and his size would continuously increase for each additional level of Grow. This had no gameplay benefit, but is a great visual that is worth mentioning. Tiny also had an Aghanim Scepter upgrade. It gave him a new ability called War Club. War Club allowed Tiny to pick up a tree and use it as a weapon. While he was carrying a tree, Tiny had bonus attack range, gained a powerful cleave, and did 150% bonus damage to buildings. Toss also had its thrown unit damage increased. War Club had no maximum duration and lasted until Tiny attacked 6 times. While this was a powerful buff, it was held back by its enormous 30-second cooldown. 30 seconds was simply too long for an attack-based spell like this. Tiny was a simple hero with only 2 active abilities, but those abilities were surprisingly flexible. He was the epitome of a strength hero, a tanky brawler that wasn't afraid to get in there and needed to be respected, as he could wreak havoc if left alone. From the very beginning, Tiny's high burst damage made him a hero worth considering. There weren't many other characters that could get kills as early and aggressively as Tiny. The Toss Avalanche combo was simply too much for most heroes to handle. His playstyle was centered entirely around enabling this combo as quickly as possible. Tiny only played in farming positions, usually in the mid. His skill build was all in on Avalanche and Toss, skipping his ultimate and Craggy until level 9. He rushed Power Threads, Bottle, and Blink Dagger. Blink Dagger was the main goal. The other 2 items were needed to enable it. Blink Dagger allowed Tiny to instantly teleport a long distance. He could use this to get right on top of his target and then combo them down with Toss and Avalanche. However, Blink Dagger used 75 mana per cast. While Tiny's mana pool wasn't bad, he used just a bit more than he naturally had access to. But Tiny had some tricks up his sleeve. Power Treads were boots that provided movement speed, attack speed, and 10 bonus points into one of strength, agility, or intelligence. Importantly, they could be toggled at any time to change which attribute they provided. When toggling into strength or intelligence, the health and mana of the hero doing the toggling also changed accordingly. This did not provide any healing, as the percentage of health and mana always stayed the same. However, Tiny's spells or his Blink Dagger had clearly defined mana costs, and a higher mana pool meant that they used a smaller percentage of it. Tiny players could toggle their power treads into intelligence right before using mana, and then toggle them back into strength or agility afterwards, at which point they used Bottle to refill their mana pool. Bottle always restored the same amount of mana, so by toggling power treads away from intelligence, it restored a higher percentage of mana. This was a fairly minor optimization that only saved a few points of mana whenever it was done. But a few points was all he needed, as those added up significantly across a game. As soon as Tiny acquired his items, ganking was all that was on his mind. He usually had a brief window of opportunity where he was capable of one-shotting anyone he came across. Toss and Avalanche did overwhelming damage that was easily amplified by Tiny, connecting with an attack. With Grow, he had some of the highest attack damage in the game, and if all he needed was one hit, then the missing attack speed didn't matter. The pressure Tiny applied on the opposing team usually forced them into playing very defensively, giving Tiny's team map control and pushing opportunities. During his peak moments, Tiny ruled the map. And as soon as his opponents became capable of tanking his damage, he fell off like a stone. This usually didn't take long, as his opponents knew what they had to work towards. While 1000 burst damage was impressive, that was also it. Tiny had no good way to deal additional damage if someone survived. Once Tiny became unable to guarantee kills with his combo, he mostly turned into a tanky stunner that provided some additional utility with Toss. This was not enough. The metagame at TI1 was too slow for the momentum Tiny earned his team to be enough to finish the game, and after that point he was simply worse than similar heroes like Beastmaster or Earthshaker that offered either more utility or better stuns. Tiny couldn't even properly scale into the mid-game. He was very much an all-or-nothing character that either hurriedly carried his team to victory or became a burden. He was only chosen in 3 games, but at least he performed reasonably well in all of them. His early strength was remarkable. It just wasn't quite enough by itself. He wasn't quite enough by himself. Tiny wasn't stressed about this, but he couldn't help but wonder to himself what would happen if only he was given a little help. After the International 1 concluded, Tiny only received a single change. His Aghanim Scepter no longer gave him a new ability and instead made all of the benefits that War Club provided a passive component of his ultimate. As soon as he purchased an Aghanim Scepter, he automatically and permanently equipped a tree that gave him bonus attack range, cleave damage, and bonus building damage. 100% uptime made Tiny's Aghanims a much more powerful effect, and so it received a significant nerf to its bonus building damage, cutting it in half to 75%. Nonetheless, this was a great Aghanim Scepter effect that immediately saw a lot of play. An important environmental change during this era was the addition of a huge number of new heroes. 46 new characters were added, greatly increasing the hero pool. The most important of those was Io. Io was a hero that required a partner and then boosted that hero's power substantially. For more detailed information, please check out our dedicated Io video. While this patch period only offered Tiny a tree and a best friend, for him, that was plenty. At the International 2012, Tiny took a look at his new buddies and fully embraced them. He remained a powerful early ganker, and his new Aghanim Scepter gave him the late-game scaling he had lacked in the previous year. To best merge these two attributes, Tiny adjusted his item build significantly. His new core consisted of 3 items that all increased his movement speed: Face Boots, Drums of Endurance, and Yasha. Tiny's ultimate also enhanced his movement speed, and this new style incorporated it at level 6. With this build, Tiny became one of the fastest moving heroes in Dota in the most honest way imaginable. While other heroes had teleporting or leaping abilities, Tiny just put on some shoes and went for a run. Turns out that when a mountain of a hero like Tiny with his great survivability comes running at 100 miles an hour, then for most purposes he might as well have had a blink dagger. Escaping was a futile effort, and good luck fighting back. Tiny's new approach may not have been subtle, but it sure was effective. While his new item build took a little while longer to come online, once he had Face Boots, drums, and some mana, usually a bottle, he could still use that early window of opportunity during which Toss Avalanche was a guaranteed kill on most of the cast. However, unlike before, Tiny could actually scale now. Aghanim Scepter was always next on the list. The damage and farming and pushing speed it provided were unmatched by anything else Tiny could buy. Its powerful cleave and the fast movement speed Tiny already invested into meant that he became a top farmer as soon as he finished the item. This allowed him to always maintain a strong economy, and that made him extremely dangerous. It made him a threat similar to one of the greatest Dota heroes of all time, Leshrac. Tiny was strong in fights, but most importantly, he could punish an opposing team for losing a fight like barely anybody else. He destroyed towers and barracks in mere seconds. The existence of Tiny alone applied an immense amount of pressure on the opposing team, as any misstep could be an immediate game over. Another item that assured Tiny's late game was Manta Star, which had an active effect that summoned 2 powerful illusions. Manta Star was usually reserved for agility heroes, as illusions only benefited from base damage and Manta Star primarily provided agility. But since Grow gave Tiny plenty of base damage, his illusions were some of the strongest in the game. Tiny's playstyle was enhanced even further by his new best bud Io. Io provided him with healing, attack speed, damage reduction, global mobility, and even more movement speed. Together they were unstoppable, as Io enabled Tiny to start ganking without any items at all and made him even more powerful in the late game. In their match against Orange, eHome played Io and Tiny and managed to outcarry an opposing Morphling in an hour-long game. This was an unbelievable feat, as Morphling was widely considered to be one of the strongest late-game carries. Io joined Tiny in over half his matches, and whenever it did, his life became significantly easier. While this new style of physical DPS Tiny took over, Tiny did also have the option of playing the old Blink Dagger-based ganking style instead. When IG played against MTW, IG's Templar Assassin had a wonderful start to the game and was primed to roll over their opponents. Tiny then built more support and ganking focus, which allowed him to enable TA instead of becoming dangerous himself. This worked marvelously and carried them to an easy victory. However, Tiny wasn't flawless. His biggest problem were pushing teams. While Toss and Avalanche were AoE spells, they had a fairly long cooldown, and so didn't perform great if it came to clearing ways to break an opposing push. Using them like this also left Tiny stranded without spells to defend himself. Tiny struggled against pushing teams, and he didn't perform much better on them either. Dedicated pushing strats aimed to end the game long before Tiny would have had enough time to purchase the items he needed to properly assist them. Their timings simply didn't match up with his. When he wanted to gank, they wanted to push, and when he wanted to push, they wanted the game to be over. And to his dismay, pushing strategies were extremely common. At the International 2012, Tiny was a niche choice. He was picked only when the game allowed for it, which also meant he was usually picked last. But as far as niche heroes are concerned, Tiny was as powerful as they got. He excelled whenever he was given the opportunity and never felt like a burden on his team. His curious blend of aggressive ganker and late-game carry made him an extremely overwhelming hero in the right circumstances. Tiny was one of the few characters that could create his own space. However, that required time. The pushing meta didn't give him much of that, and as such Tiny was only contested in 18 games. But he performed great in the matches that he played, and he came out of them with a 57% win rate. Tiny was not a standard choice, but also by no means a hero that could be ignored. Tiny's performance at TI2 was fine, so he didn't receive many changes in the following patch period. TOS had its cast range buffed to a constant 1300 and its cooldown decreased by 1, and could now be used to toss units to runes. And that was it. Unfortunately, the international free didn't go so well for Tiny. This tournament was dominated by a defensive playstyle that prioritized farming and minimized risk. Risk a team might experience during aggressive ganking or pushing. There were many matches that had single-digit kill counts until the final fight. The general approach to Dota simply wasn't right for Tiny. His strength came from merging aggression with late-game potential. If he couldn't be aggressive, then all he was a mediocre late-game carry, and in that situation, why pick him over a better hero with more utility and scaling? Lifestealer, Alchemist and Naga Siren easily outclassed him in both those aspects. The one game Tiny was chosen in, he didn't perform well, as his team got destroyed in only 17 minutes, and so TI3 ended early for Tiny. After TI3, Tiny again only received a few changes to a single ability. Craggy Exterior had its stun duration and proc chance slightly increased. Then it was time for the next tournament. TI4 presented Tiny with many of the same issues that he had faced in the previous years. Pushing teams were powerful and incredibly overwhelming. This was in large part because towers were worth an unbelievable amount of gold. For a team that maintained a good pushing presence and regularly took tower kills, farming was entirely unnecessary. This style was discovered during the tournament and became more pronounced as it went on. However, not every team in every match was pushing. The famous 20-minute TI4 matches mostly came from Vici Gaming and Newbie. The other teams were actually playing more similar to the TI3 style of passive farming. While this may sound like a hostile environment for Tiny, one group of players actually embraced him as a counter for the passive approach to Dota. Both Na'Vi and Na'Vi US chose Tiny frequently. They always played him in a dual mid lane, paired with Io. If given the opportunity, the two would go for aggressive ganks using Relocate, but that wasn't actually their priority. Instead, they aimed to get an Aghanim Scepter as quickly as possible. Power Treads, maybe Drums of Endurance, but sometimes also just a Bracer, and then Axe ideally by around 15 minutes. Once he had it, Tiny could farm rapidly, as the item offered a fantastic cleaving effect which worked great with Tiny's naturally high attack damage. Tiny always being paired with Io gave him a ton of time to farm without needing to worry about being available for fights, as Io could just teleport him in when they were needed. Then Na'Vi set up for a timing push at around 30 minutes. Tiny should have a BKB and a Soul Cross by then, which made him overwhelmingly powerful in fights and let him break buildings in seconds. This timing caught many teams off guard, as it was slightly too early for the usual farming strategies to be ready to take Tiny on. Na'Vi's use of Tiny as a tempo carry was very successful and won them many games. However, the build had a glaring weakness. When Na'Vi tried playing it against Newbie never gave them time to breathe. They took tower after tower after tower, forcing teamfights as early as 9 minutes into the game, long before Tiny would ever have had the chance to get the levels or gold he needed. By 15 minutes, they were already pushing the base, and Tiny wasn't even level 9. Newbie finished the game by 20 minutes, and Na'Vi never got close to their desired timing. Tiny still didn't work well against dedicated pushing teams, and so as Na'Vi was knocked out, he vanished from the tournament. At TI4, Tiny was a tempo carry that aimed to counter late-game farming strategies. He excelled in that role and won 5 out of the 7 games that he was played in. However, he still folded to pushing strategies, and so he didn't see widespread use. 2014 was also when Tiny and Io truly manifested as a bonded pair. They got along great and enabled each other's strengths wonderfully. Hello, thank you very much for watching the video. Don't worry, it'll continue in 1 second. I'm just here to tell you to leave a thumbs up if you haven't yet and to become a channel member if you aren't one. Being a channel member is really the best way to support this channel. It's a direct way of making sure that we can continue working on these videos, as AdSense by itself is a little lackluster, let's just put it that way. But either way, we just appreciate that you're watching the video, and again, if you've enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you are a channel member, if you do become a channel member, you do get the videos early. We're currently a little behind. Don't worry, we'll catch up. Next video is gonna be a bit quicker. But you do also get bonus videos and, of course, the versions of the videos without any sort of interruptions like this one, or without ad reads, which makes it much nicer to just watch and maybe rewatch if that's something you're interested in. Anyway, let's get back to the video. Patch 6.82 significantly reworked the gold mechanics of Dota 2. Towers had their bounties significantly reduced, and hero bounties were made to scale better across the length of a game, moving Dota away from pushing and more towards farming and fighting for map control. Bounty runes were also added. They spawned once every 2 minutes at one of the rune locations and could be picked up to gain a bit of gold and experience. They also refilled bottle. Then 6.84 added a whole slew of new items. Out of those, Moonshot was the most interesting to Tiny. Moonshot was an item that provided the highest amount of bonus attack speed out of any item in the game. It also provided a bit of night vision. Moonshot could be activated to be consumed. A consumed Moonshot granted permanent bonus attack speed, although less than the non-consumed version. Moonshot was generally used as a 7th item slot. After carry filled up their inventory completely, they would then move on to consume a Moonshot. Tiny was the only hero in Dota that would occasionally buy a rather early Moonshot solely for the attack speed bonus. Tiny himself also received a few minor changes. Toss now had a slightly longer flight duration, which effectively meant its stun was longer, had its grab radius slightly increased, and most importantly, was no longer random. Instead of choosing a random unit in his grab radius, Tiny now always tossed the unit closest to him, adding some much needed consistency to the ability. Before, Toss was often unpredictable in big teamfights. Now, a Tiny that paid close attention could always toss the units he wanted to. Finally, gross movement speed bonus was increased at early levels. The International 5 marked the beginning of a new Dota. As towers had their bounties drastically reduced, dedicated pushing teams faded into the background. In its place, the jungle became the focal point of competitive play. Most matches had both teams dedicate one of their supports to getting big stacks ready for their carries to clear out after the laning stage. Contesting and potentially stealing these stacks was often a game-winning play. Heroes like Queen of Pain, LeShock and Gyrocopter excelled in this environment, as their big AoEs and strong early presence allowed them to both take their own team's stacks and contest their opponents. In this new environment, Tiny didn't change much. He didn't have to, as Dota had changed to be better for him. Let's have a closer look at how he was played by one of the best teams of the tournament, LGD, during LGD vs MEP Phoenix in their group stages series. The game starts out with a big fight over the first bounty rune. Here, Tiny's high survivability already shows, as he can stand and fight while surrounded by enemies, and they know that killing him would take too long to be worth the trouble. Then Tiny moves into the mid lane. Here, he is backed up by Io. During TI5, Tiny almost exclusively played mid lanes with Io. Tiny by himself was a mid laner. He had a big buffer of health that allowed him to go for last hits and trade attacks with his opponent, and after a few levels he could threaten kills with Toss and Avalanche. However, if his opponent played aggressively, they could drain his health pool by harassing him with attacks, which quickly added up and could force him out of lane. That's where Io came in. Io supplied Tiny with a non-stop stream of bottle healing and kept him healthy and ready to go. This made fighting into Tiny extremely risky. MVP Phoenix figured this out the hard way, as every time they dare step close to him during the early game, he ends up securing a kill for his team. While Tiny is laning, Io is busy stacking the jungle and securing runes. It always stays in close enough proximity to be able to help when needed, but not so close to be taking away Tiny's experience. After Tiny has secured level 6, he moves to the camps that Io stacked for him and takes them down with his powerful AoE spells. This allows Io to catch up in experience and lets Tiny continue building his lead, as he is now comfortably holding the top net worth position. Tiny was not the type of carry to rest on his gold. Instead, he purchases a Blink Dagger as his first proper item and immediately moves to the bottom lane and gets a kill. With Blink Dagger and level 9, Tiny is easily the strongest hero on the map, capable of killing anyone. This won't be true for long. Tiny has about 1000 burst damage, which is currently enough to kill anyone, but soon won't be, as MVP will purchase defensive items to get past that threshold. He wants to use this brief window of opportunity to the greatest extent possible, so Tiny roams the map, crushing anyone that steps before him. For the next 10 minutes, MVP live in fear. Any hero that shows themselves on the map falls before Tiny. Due to Io giving him a global presence with Relocate, there is nowhere to hide. If Tiny sees somebody, they are dead. Increasing the tempo of the game by this much severely limits how the opposing Naga Siren can farm. Nonetheless, she manages to sneak around Tiny enough to purchase a Radiance by 20 minutes. This is not a good timing. However, Tiny hasn't been farming either. He's been focused on hunting for kills, which unintuitively means he has less money than a regular farming carry would. As Tiny mostly killed heroes that were much weaker than him, their bounties also weren't that high. His way to build a lead was to suppress his opponents. If they couldn't farm, then it was fine if he also had less money than a more passive hero would have. What mattered was the difference between him and his opponents, and he could continue growing that gap over his power spike period. Tiny changed the economy of Dota and enforced his will upon it. After his Blink Dagger, Tiny purchases Drums of Endurance and then Aghanim's Scepter. It's the Na'Vi style from the previous year, although with a Blink Dagger fitted to ensure Tiny's early presence. With his tree equipped, LGD start pushing the mid. But as the damage adds up, they realize that it's a bit too early for them to go for the base. While Tiny was powerful in ganks, teamfights were a bit different. During ganks, simply being tanky was a fine tool to survive. During teamfights, having at least some additional protection was usually required, as otherwise even the most powerful character could just get stunned repeatedly until they died. That's exactly what happens to Tiny here. As LGD and MVP clash near Roshan, Tiny is locked down, unable to fight properly. While he certainly does a lot of damage, it's no longer enough to instantly kill his opponents, and so MVP tank through his initial hits and then kill him. Naga Siren takes over as the top farmer of the game, an intimidating prospect. Still, Tiny is no slouch during the later stages himself, and so LGD slow the game down a bit. They farm, finish up important items, and then take Roshan. Tiny has an Assault Cross and an Aegis now, and is ready to go for another push. As LGD move into the mid, MVP aren't quite ready to fight, and they respond too slowly. Tiny with Aghanim's Scepter, level 3 ultimate and an Assault Cross has one of the fastest pushing speeds in the entire game. He manages to break down the melee barracks before MVP can even get into position to fight. However, as Tiny still doesn't have a BKB, he gets locked down again and falls. Despite losing their barracks, MVP managed to stay in the game. At this point, Tiny can't solo kill anyone anymore. Even the supports have enough health to survive the combo, and going for a kill on them could quickly turn sour due to their disables. Tiny's initial power spike has faded away, and now he needs to win the match by contesting a Naga Siren as a carry. Should the game continue on for a significant amount of time, then he stands no chance against her. This is the main problem Tiny had. He had two big timings that he needed to hit, and he needed to hit them hard. The first was his early ganking presence, which he needed to go well to build momentum and to stop his opponents from out-farming him. The second came a few minutes after the window of the first closed, right as Tiny finished Aghanim Scepter, Assault Cross and BKB. These items had to be enough to finish the match, as Tiny couldn't scale as much as other carries. While at TI2 we saw a match of Tiny and Io properly contesting a Morphling in the late game, unfortunately Io had been nerfed significantly since then, which made this task much more difficult. As the final step in this match, Tiny uses the resources he earned during his strong mid-game to buy a BKB and then finishes the match with a strong push through the bottom lane. At the International 5, Tiny was almost exclusively played as a mid laner with Io. When I say almost exclusively, I mean in every single game but one. In that one match, he instead played a dual offlane where he was a core to a techie support who he spent most of the game throwing at his opponents. That game was a bit weird, and definitely the exception that proves the rule, as it was Tiny's least impactful performance. Still, even in that game, he actually did pretty well, and the same was true for all the games that he played mid. The addition of bounty runes really helped his consistency, as it made it much easier for Io to always have bottle charges available for healing. At this point, we should also make sure to not leave unsaid something that may have become obvious. Tiny was strong because he paired well with Io. Io was one of the greatest, most impactful Dota heroes of all time. Tiny being good with Io was a great selling point, but it also meant he didn't have a strong individual identity. Nonetheless, Tiny did well at TI5. He was played in 9 games, out of which he won 4. While certainly not an overly impressive performance, in the actual games Tiny always had a decent impact. Even the casters never viewed Tiny as an unusual pick. He was a niche character for when a team wanted to play aggressively and knew how to utilize his 30 to 35 minute timing push. LGD played him more than anyone else, and they won 3 out of their 4 games with Tiny. They ended up placing 3rd overall, so they clearly knew what they were doing. In my opinion, Tiny was probably a bit underrated. His power was remarkable in the right circumstances, and those circumstances weren't all that rare. But his lack of popularity was understandable. The competitive community was still getting used to the new style of Dota with much less emphasis on pushing strategies. As Tiny was a bit of an all-in character, taking on that additional risk simply wasn't worth the stress. Overall, TI5 was a fine tournament for Tiny. He was by no means one of the top picks, but he certainly wasn't bad either. He was a hero to be chosen in the right circumstances, and one that must be respected once they arose. Tiny also continued to enjoy the presence of Io in nearly every game, and together they had become iconic. As we are used to by now, Tiny again only received minor changes before the next tournament. His base strength and base agility were slightly increased. Toss had its cooldown reduced by 1 second. And Craggy exterior was changed to now trigger when an attack landed, as opposed to when it started. This change was likely less about balance and more about game feel, as before Craggy triggered at unintuitive moments. Regardless of intent, this change was still a nerf, as Tiny now had to tank a hit before Craggy could trigger. Dota itself continued to evolve, as many new items were added into the game. Out of those, Tiny cared the most about Echo Saber. Echo Saber was built out of an Oblivion Staff and an Ogre Club. It provided the stats of both items, being a solid amount of strength, damage, attack speed, intelligence, and mana regeneration. Echo Saber wasn't particularly expensive and had a nice build-up. It provided its stats at a discount and it had a powerful passive effect. If the hero carrying an Echo Saber was a melee hero, then after they attacked, they would instantly attack again. This effect had a 5-second cooldown. Echo Saber seemed as if it was made exactly for Tiny. He got great use out of all its stats, and the double strike passive worked perfectly with Tiny's incredibly low attack speed but massive damage. Another item addition during this time period was Iron Talon. Iron Talon was a cheap item that had an active effect that instantly dealt a significant amount of damage to a creep. TI5 had been dominated by stacking strategies, and Iron Talon was Valve's response. At the International 2016, Tiny continued playing in much the same way he had before. His core strategy of an aggressive early game transitioned into a tempo push remained unchanged. However, the meta of the tournament shifted and left him behind. Iron Talon had a massive impact on how Dota 2 was played. Teams no longer invested their early game resources into setting up jungle stacks. That's because doing so was entirely unnecessary. Jungle stacks had been the best way to farm because every camp stacked was a camp killed. Ultimately, it didn't matter when a spawn of creeps died. By stacking, teams could secure the spawn and then kill the creeps later. This delay had been necessary because the vast majority of heroes had no way of killing jungle creeps early in the game. However, Iron Talon vastly expanded the pool of heroes that could simply walk into the jungle and get themselves some creep kills during the early game. This made the jungle a much more actively used resource and reduced the need for stacking. At certain times, stacking even became strictly undesirable, as a jungle stacked was more difficult to kill for a hero with Iron Talon than an individual creep camp would have been. At TI5, Tiny had relied on two things to get his early momentum started. One were the now absent jungle stacks. The other was Io. Io hadn't become worse. Not at all. The hero was nothing short of excellent. The problem was very much the opposite. Io was so good that it was banned in the majority of games. Tiny couldn't partner with Io because Io was the most banned hero of the tournament. With his two key pieces gone, Tiny couldn't hit his timing anymore. His Blink Dagger came out too late, which delayed all of his other items and often left him without the ability to even kill supports. It hurts to say, but at TI6, Tiny was bad. He only saw playing 5 games and failed to contribute anything of note in all of them. The teams that picked him would have been better off with a different hero, and all of his item builds were meant more about trying to survive than about playing the proactive carry role he was meant to embody. Tiny also became keenly aware of his dependency on Io. They had been partners, but were they still? Io was thriving without Tiny, and Tiny had nothing he could do by himself. He was still happily cheering for his friend as it competed on the grand stage, but Tiny couldn't stop himself from wondering if this was healthy. Patch 7.0 brought along with it the addition of talent trees to Dota 2. Each hero was given a unique set of upgrades that they would pick and choose from as they went through a game. The first iteration of talents was mostly composed of what I will refer to as generic talents. A generic talent provided a simple stat boost, like for example extra strength, movement speed, or armor. Tiny's talents fell mostly into this category, as only one of his upgrades wasn't generic. Generic talents weren't necessarily bad, and in particular at level 15, Tiny had some powerful options available to him. Aside from that, Craggy Exterior was updated to only work against melee heroes, but with a more consistent trigger chance that was further amplified by Grow, higher damage, and a higher stun duration. It also provided an additional point of armor. Craggy Exterior had always been Tiny's least useful tool, and while these buffs were nice, they didn't really address the fact that the ability was too passive for a hero as active as Tiny. Toss was changed to now be able to throw units at spell-immune targets, a relatively minor change that only mattered in niche situations. Finally, Tiny received an incredible 7-point boost to his base damage. His base damage had already been good, and now it was one of the highest in the game. All of the issues that had plagued Tiny at TI6 persisted throughout the following year, and the addition of talents added another huge problem to the pile. Since most talents were generic, they often offered a small boost of survivability, whether that be through strength, magic resistance, or simply bonus health. Because of talents, many heroes could reach that threshold where Tiny became unable to combo kill them much more easily. Without the ability to get kills, Tiny couldn't gather momentum, and without momentum, Tiny was a wasted pick. It certainly didn't help that IO continued to be perma-banned, and Tiny was never given a chance to partner with it. You might have heard me say before that TI7 was one of the most balanced Dota tournaments of all time, with a wide range of viable heroes and strategies. While true, Tiny unfortunately was one of the 5 characters to not see any play at the International 2017. For a long time, Tiny had been a niche character that was incredibly dangerous in the right circumstances. But with 7.0, power creep had reached an unprecedented level, and it was only going to continue. Tiny also couldn't keep relying on IO. They got along great, but at this stage, Tiny was nothing more than a burden on his best friend. His best friend, who was thriving. Tiny wasn't going to be responsible for holding IO back. No, it was time for Tiny to stand beside IO as not just a friend, but an equal. And so Tiny shed his shell as patch 7.07 removed craggy exterior. In its place, Tiny gained Tree Grab. Tree Grab allowed Tiny to pick up a tree that increased his attack range and gave his attacks a powerful cleaving effect. While he was carrying a tree, Tiny also dealt bonus attack damage and an additional bonus to buildings. Tree Grab lasted until Tiny had attacked upwards of 5 times at max level. Tiny could also end the ability early by throwing his tree at a target unit, in which case it would trigger an attack on that target when it hit. As Tree Grab was nearly identical to it, Tiny's Aghanim Scepter upgrade was removed. Tree Grab started out as an unimpressive ability, as it had a huge cooldown of 40 seconds and only lasted for 2 attacks at level 1. To get any use out of the spell, Tiny had to max it out. Over the next few patches, Tree Grab was refined. All of its numbers were buffed, most notably it had its number of attacks increased to a static 5 and its cooldown significantly reduced. Its damage boost against buildings was also increased by 50% of its original value. At the end of all its adjustments, Tree Grab was nothing short of one of the best abilities in the game. Grow also received significant changes. It now gave Tiny a massive amount of status resistance. Its damage was slightly nerfed, but it now reduced his attack speed by less. Grow also no longer amplified Tiny's other abilities. Along with the changes to his abilities, Tiny received one of the more unique adjustments to his base attributes. He lost all of his starting agility and agility growth. Tiny no longer gained any agility by himself and had to get it through items. While Tiny never had much agility in the first place, this still mattered specifically because he no longer gained natural armor. Since he lost Craggy as well, Tiny became incredibly vulnerable to physical damage. Within only a few patches, Grow gained a new property, now providing Tiny significant bonus armor for each level, but in turn, it no longer gave him bonus movement speed. He also had his survivability boosted even further by increases to his starting strength and strength gain. Toss and Avalanche both received small boosts to their early damage and had their cooldowns slightly increased. They now required less ability levels to be powerful early. Finally, Tiny's talent tree was reworked and made just fantastic. 20% magic resistance or 30 damage at level 10 were both top tier in their raw numbers. 125 extra avalanche damage counted towards the doubling bonus that Tiny could get by doing his combo, so in practice it was often an extra 250 damage. And toss requiring no target meant that Tiny could throw units wherever he pleased. It let him save allies out of a dire situation, or he could toss his opponents up on cliffs they couldn't get down from. This became especially difficult to deal with when Tiny gained free toss charges, which made the ability endlessly spammable. Tiny's talent tree was one of the strongest in the game and had clearly been given lots of special attention. The International 2018 marked Dota's transition into yet again a new era. As power and resource creep ramped up, the dominant strategy became what is the standard today: 2-1-2 lanes with a position 1 through 5 farming distribution. 2-1-2 lanes describes the amount of heroes per lane. If we assume we are on the Radiant side, then that would be 2 in the top, 1 in the mid and 2 in the bottom lane. While this had always been the standard for public games, in Pro Dota it was considered a fairly bad strategy for a long time. Instead, most games followed a 1-1-3 tri-lane setup. One hero on the top who was mostly left abandoned and had to try their best to somehow find farm, one hero on the mid who needed to create space for their team, and then 3 heroes in the bottom lane, with one of them being a carry that farmed creeps and the other 2 supports that protected and enabled that carry. In this setup, only the mid and the carry had the opportunity to build significant items. However, as Dota continued its development, more and more gold and experience became available on the map, and all heroes were made more powerful at a baseline level. This pushed players towards putting more emphasis on their supports, and eventually one of these support roles became another carry. To enable this new offlane carry, they had to be given a support, which shifted Dota towards 2-1-2 lanes. At first, the offlane carry was a distinctly different role from the safe lane carry. They had what was called a lower farming priority. If 2 heroes had access to, for example, a jungle camp, then the hero with the higher priority would get to farm it. Teams started assigning each player a different position number, with position 1 being the hero that had the highest farming priority and position 5 the hero with the lowest. If position 1 and position 3 had access to a creep camp at the same time, then position 1 would get to farm it. For position 3 and 5, it would be position 3. This wasn't a mechanical difference between heroes, but simply how the language and understanding of Dota had evolved over the years. I'm explaining this now because we're going to need clear language to fully appreciate everything Tiny became able to do. First, he returned to the mid. Because Tree Grab gave him significant range and fantastic bonus damage, Tiny no longer needed help to win the lane. No, much the opposite. Tiny became one of the strongest laners in the entire game and was even capable of beating incredible powerhouses like Broodmother and Lina. While Tree Grab only lasted for 5 attacks, due to Tiny's already high damage getting a significant boost, those 5 attacks were guaranteed last hits or denies. With some good planning, he could also use the cleaving effect of Tree Grab to get even more. Tree Grab also had a unique quirk that made it so its cleave would still trigger even if Tiny was denying creeps. This let him use denies to last hit creeps and harass his opponents. If he wanted to, he could also use his Tree Grab charges to simply harass directly, which was extremely effective and difficult to go up against. All of this was amplified by Tiny's ability to throw the tree. While this used up Tree Grab's remaining charges, if only one was left, it came with no downside. Every 5th attack, Tiny had an incredibly long-range AoE attack that functioned independently from his actual attack speed. He could use it to finish off fleeing opponents or to get a last hit while harassing or as an instant bonus attack. Since Grow gave Tiny overwhelming attack damage, getting an instant hit from Tree Grab was equally overwhelming and immediately became a significant component of his combo. While before he had been limited to Toss, Avalanche and an attack, now he could use Toss, Avalanche, attack, use Echo Saber for an instant follow-up and then throw his tree for a 3rd hit. His combo became much more powerful and scaled better into the late game. This was even amplified by his fantastic plus 125 avalanche damage at level 15, which added another 250 damage to the combo. Tiny no longer had to worry about missing his timing, as his damage was way higher than before and his window of opportunity much longer. Not that it would have been a problem anyway, as he got there much quicker. Since Tiny was such a strong laner, he had no problems playing on his own. which gave him fast levels, and Tree Grab was a great farming tool, which meant he could hit his Blink Dagger timing even without assistance. From here, his playstyle remained the same as before. He was just much better at it. He roamed, he ganked, he carried as a building crusher. His skill build enabled this. Tree Grab at level 1, then Avalanche, Toss, Max Out Avalanche, Grow at 6 and Max Out Toss second. While delaying Toss may give the impression that his burst potential was weakened, Tree Grab more than made up for it, and Tiny remained capable of killing anyone during the early stages of a game. As a mid, Tiny usually played a position-free role. His emphasis was less on farming and more on buying his team time and momentum, and his item purchases reflected that. Ring of Aquila, Power Treads and Bottle for the laning stage, then Blink Dagger into a fast Echo Saber or Shadow Blade, and then the other. In an ideal scenario, he could forcefully end games long before his opponents had a chance to recover from his aggression. This older style of all-in mid Tiny was risky, but still popular, but also, unfortunately, not very successful. It accounted for 47% of his games, but had an abysmal win rate of 30%. As his opponents were well aware of the aggressive tempo and mid Tiny demanded, they usually slowed the game down as much as possible and tried to deny him his momentum-building plays. Mid Tiny often came down to just a few key moments that decided his performance for the entire match, and at TI8, he often couldn't find what he needed. However, Tiny was much more than a mid. He was also played as a position 1 carry. Here he played much the same, except that Tiny traded off faster levels for easier, more dependable farm. Tiny needed levels. He specifically wanted a fast level 12 to get all of his damage maxed out. But as it turned out, level 12 also wasn't that difficult to get for position 1 Tiny, and the additional gold he earned by laning in a more secure spot made his mid-game tempo much more reliable. 23% of Tiny's games were as a safe lane carry, and here he had a fantastic 61% win rate. Tiny was also used as an offlane carry. Here his job was primarily to be a lane bully that shut down the opposing position 1 from the earliest moments of the game. He was still played as a position 3 with no alteration to his item or skill build. 14 games here with a 43% win rate. Finally, for a few games, Tiny took the role of an offlane support, the position 4. It may come as a surprise, but Tiny was now a natural at supporting. With Tree Grab, he had enough range to challenge anyone, and his massive attack damage easily outclassed any other supports. Despite being a melee hero, Tiny had no problems trading hits with long-range supports, and he always came out of it favorably. When he was played as a support, Avalanche and Toss were less commonly used for their combo damage because Tiny wouldn't have the levels he needed to overwhelm his opponents. This was no problem. Avalanche was still a long-range AoE stun on a reasonable cooldown, and Toss was one of the most versatile abilities in the game. Tiny could throw allies into a fight to help them initiate, or he could throw them away from a fight to help save them. With a Blink Dagger, he could initiate by throwing an opposing hero straight to his teammates, or he could mess up his opponent's positioning by getting frontliners away from their targets. Toss was only limited by Tiny's imagination. His mere presence forced the opposing team to be incredibly cautious of any movements, as the smallest misstep could quickly spiral out of control. Tiny's incredible bulk also helped him in playing a supporting role. It was common strategy to target the squishy supports at the start of fights to get rid of their pesky disables. But taking down Tiny was no easy task, no matter what role he played. His high strength gain, early HP boosting talent, and grow bonus armor allowed him to survive hits no other support could. Grow also provided Tiny with a massive amount of status resistance, which made properly disabling him nearly impossible. This had value not just when he was supporting, but also in any of the other positions he played. Stuns thrown at Tiny had to be of the longest duration available, otherwise he easily shrugged them off and continued fighting. While he had lost his movement speed, he had become an unshakable mountain of a hero that stopped only when killed. Surprisingly, despite having less money, Support Tiny still bought the same items that any of the other roles did. Power Treads, Bottle, Blink, Shadow Blade and Echo Saber. The item set simply worked great on the hero. Despite the many unique and impactful properties support Tiny brought to the table, this style was the least popular of the bunch, only being played for 8 games with a 50% win rate. It was still a new approach to a hero that had traditionally been nothing but a carry. At TI8, Tiny was one of the best heroes in the game. He saw wide use and played multiple different roles and positions. Tree Grab made him one of the strongest and most versatile laners in the game, while also significantly boosting his combo damage and letting him scale powerfully into the late game. While over the past 7 years, Tiny had always stood in the shadow of his best friend Io, at the International 2018, he proved himself worthy of standing next to it. Tiny was contested in 173 games, nearly 90% of the entire tournament, and the exact same number of games as Io. They shared the number 3 spot for the most contested hero of the tournament. While Tiny's overall win rate was a lacking 41%, in the games he was played, he always had a significant impact and clearly showed that he was powerful. It took no time at all for Tiny to be nerfed. Tree Grab had its cooldown and mana cost increased at early levels, and its damage bonus decreased. It also no longer applied its cleave damage when Tiny was denying. Then Avalanche and Grow were reworked. Avalanche had its duration extended and no longer was a simple stun and damage. Instead, it stunned and damaged all units inside of its AoE repeatedly, once every 0.3 seconds for a 0.2 seconds stun. In many situations, this acted more or less the same as before, but one crucial interaction that changed was that players could now activate BKB in those short intervals between stuns, which protected them from the rest of the ability. Avalanche also had its cooldown reduced, its radius significantly increased, and its damage nerfed during early levels. Its combo multiplier with Toss was also increased from twice the damage to thrice the damage. While this may sound like a wild buff, due to the extended duration of Avalanche, Toss didn't cover the whole duration anymore, and the total damage remained about the same. However, in very late game scenarios, Tiny could get a talent that gave him multiple Toss charges. If he used Toss twice during Avalanche, both tosses would amplify the damage Avalanche dealt, and with his plus 125 Avalanche damage talent, Tiny could easily deal above 1800 damage with his extended combo. The new Avalanche was a bit strong at first, and so in the following patch it had its cooldown, level 15 talent, and AoE slightly nerfed. Grow was reworked to no longer provide status resistance and instead offer Tiny significantly more armor. When Valve first implemented status resistance, they freely handed it out, and Tiny had received a particularly large slice. This was incredibly unpopular in the community, and as such, status resistance was tuned back a lot, including Tiny's ultimate. Tiny received a new Aghanim Scepter upgrade. He gained the Tree Volley ability. When cast onto an area, Tiny would stand still and channel to throw a random nearby tree into the target area every 0.4 seconds. Whenever a tree landed, it dealt 120% of Tiny's attack damage to all enemies within the area. This counted as an attack and could trigger attack modifiers like Critical Strike or Echo Saber. Echo Saber specifically had a weird interaction with Tree Volley. Echo Saber applied a slow whenever it triggered, and this slow would only happen if the item was off cooldown. As the item's double attack trigger happened, it went on cooldown, and as such, the slow would not trigger again until that cooldown was over. However, for some reason, Tree Volley triggered Echo Saber's slow without putting it on cooldown. This meant that it constantly applied the 100% Echo Saber slow with every single tree thrown. Tree Volley already had a fairly large AoE of 400. With the constant slow of Echo Saber, escaping the volley once caught within it was incredibly difficult. Tree Volley could be channeled for up to 2.4 seconds, had a long 1300 cast range, and only a 12-second cooldown. This Aghanim Scepter effect was incredibly powerful. Its only downside was that it required Tiny to be near trees, as otherwise the ability wouldn't have anything to throw. Shortly before TI9, Tiny received a few more buffs. His intelligence gain was increased, Tree Grab had its cooldown reduced, and Grow had its armor gain increased. At the International 2019, Tiny became a ranged hero. His playstyle saw a fundamental shift as the loss of status resistance made him much less effective as a brawler. However, his new Aghanim Scepter allowed him a whole new playstyle that was no less powerful. Instead of frontlining for his team, the range afforded to Tiny by all of his abilities allowed him to keep his opponents at bay and then to rain down a destructive barrage of trees every 12 seconds. This simple strategy was so effective that it became the main driving force for all carry Tiny strategies. No matter if he was played in position 1, 2 or 3, Tiny always went for an iteration of the exact same item build. Early boots and mana items into Blink Dagger, Echo Saber, Aghanim Scepter and Critical Strike. While the exact order varied a bit, the complete item set always looked the same. The only inconsistency was dependent on if the Tiny player felt a BKB was necessary, in which case it would often be bought after Aghanim Scepter and before Critical Strike. This item build seems very similar to what Tiny used at the previous tournaments, and during the early game, even the most attentive viewer could easily be fooled into thinking that he had remained entirely unchanged. He was still one of the strongest laners in the game, capable of taking on even powerhouses like Razor, and a fast Blink Dagger was still a core expected part of his kit that then allowed him to roam the map and find kills on squishy opponents caught out of position. However, as power creep had continued over the years, Tiny's window of opportunity had shrunk again, and a few players didn't even go for ganks anymore, instead maxing out tree grab first to increase their farming speed. Either way, Tiny's goal no longer was to completely overwhelm his opponents, and instead to give his team enough early game presence that they could take the opposing tier 1 towers quickly to open up more farming space. From here, he settled into a more passive role that focused on farming and getting his core items. Once he had them, it was usually time to fight again, as both teams looked for larger objective opportunities like Barracks or Roshan. In these fights, Tiny played at a distance to enable his Aghanim Scepter. Tree Volley was both incredibly powerful and had a massive cast range, but it required Tiny to be next to trees. If we look at all the common locations where fights took place, like in front of towers, the barracks or Roshan, we can see that trees weren't available in the middle of them. Needing trees forced Tiny into the outskirts of fights. He had to position himself at just the right spots to be able to cast Tree Volley, while also not being too far away to get use out of Avalanche and Toss. This is why Blink Dagger remained a core component of the hero. Early game he used it to gank, mid game he farmed with it, and once he had Aghanims, he needed its help to properly position himself during fights. While Tree Volley certainly required a lot of effort to be used properly, its overwhelming power easily justified any such troubles. Tree Volley annihilated even the tankiest heroes, and because it hit a massive AoE, its damage wasn't limited to only one opponent. Tiny could instantly kill multiple heroes or even an entire team by himself. His unmatched damage output, combined with his strong laning presence and respectable farming and pushing speed, made Tiny one of the premier picks of TI9. His carry build alone would have been enough to elevate him to a top pick, but Support Tiny also continued to be played. Support Tiny usually took the position 4 offlane support role and focused his attention on aggressive power plays, either tossing an ally to initiate fights or starting them himself with Avalanche and then tossing opponents out of position. His naturally high health and attack damage allowed him to trade hits with the opposing supports freely, and the ever-present threat of Avalanche and Toss gave him a powerful laning presence that worked great when paired with strong laning cores like Enchantress. This simple approach was so effective that Support Tiny often skipped Tree Grab entirely and instead prioritized his burst potential, which then brings up the question if Tiny could have played like this all along, even before his rework. I suppose we'll never know for sure, but I believe this to be the case. Support Tiny may have had different priorities than Carry Tiny, but he still built very similar items: Blink Dagger, Echo Saber, Aghanim Scepter. Even at the much slower pace a position 4 Tiny gathered them, these items were simply way too effective to skip. although sometimes support Tiny would focus on utility items like Force Staff or Urn of Shadows instead. This was particularly common in faster-paced games that either went very well or very badly. In exceptionally long games, support Tiny could even transition from being a support into his carry role. He ultimately didn't need a lot of items to deal tremendous damage, and since there was significant overlap between the two styles, switching gears was only limited by his income. Occasionally, he ended up with enough gold to swap roles, and all of a sudden the opposing team had to stare down a fourth carry. At the International 2019, Tiny remained as one of the top picks of the tournament. While his ganking power level had diminished from the previous year, the new tools he had been given and the new style that came with them allowed him to stay on top of competitive Dota. Tiny was contested in 94 games with a 53% win rate. For about 2/3 of those games, he played as a carry and 1/3 as a support. The champions of TI9, OG, loved Tiny. They played him more than anybody else in both roles, and they won 8 out of their 10 matches with the hero. Notably, they picked him in all 4 games of the Grand Finals. In terms of actual picks, Tiny was the 3rd most picked hero of the tournament. He was nothing short of one of the best heroes in the game. The International 10 was delayed for a year, and the corresponding 2-year period was a particularly busy one for Dota 2. The first patch after TI9 heavily nerfed Tree Volley. Its damage was reduced and both its mana cost and cooldown were increased. In a later patch, its cast range was also decreased, and Echo Saber was changed to no longer trigger on every Tree Volley hit, but only the first. These changes were clearly aimed to make Tree Volley no longer an incredibly overwhelming ability, and they accomplished their goal. Tree Volley still remained a dangerous spell, but nowhere near the power it had been before. Avalanche and Toss were both slightly nerfed, and then Valve tried an experiment with Tiny. They reduced his base damage by a massive 15 and reworked Tree Grab to no longer have a charge limit. Tree Grab also had its building damage nerfed significantly and now slowed Tiny while he was carrying a tree. This was intended to be a trade-off for Tiny. Tree Grab became a stance of sorts that allowed Tiny to trade in mobility for power. However, it quickly turned out that power was always the correct choice, and after some initial attempts at balancing this new Tiny by nerfing his other attributes and abilities, notably nerfing Avalanche's duration from 1.8 seconds to 1.4, Valve undid this rework and went back to the old charges-based system. Tiny's base damage reduction, however, remained, and this left him in a weird spot where he had been hit by heavy nerfs because of an ability rework that was then undone. And so, in a surprise twist, Tiny received a series of buffs. Tree Grab had its cooldown and mana cost reduced, while Grow had its damage and armor bonus increased and its attack speed penalty reduced. Then patch 7.28 came around and introduced Aghanim's Shard, a consumable item that could be purchased after 20 minutes that either upgraded an ability or granted a new one. Tiny's Aghanim's Shard returned Craggy Exterior. Unfortunately, Craggy Exterior had never been good, and so Tiny's Aghanim's Shard was hardly ever purchased. Patch 7.29 removed Craggy and replaced it with a new shard upgrade that removed the charge limit on Tree Grab. With this upgrade, Tiny now had access to both his old Aghanim Scepter effect and his new one. His starting strength and strength gain were also increased again, which made him even bulkier than he had already been. Tiny was buff. Around this time, a long-standing interaction of Tiny's toss started gaining some notoriety. When Tiny tossed a hero, that hero would always land at the designated target at the end of the toss duration. This may sound like I'm just describing how toss worked, but take what I said literally. A tossed hero would always land at the target location at the end of the toss duration, even if that hero was no longer in the air. There were a few ways to accomplish this, but the one that grabbed players' attention was death. If a hero died during toss and then bought back while toss was still strictly speaking active, they would teleport to the landing location. This led to more than just a few instances of pro players getting killed, buying back, teleporting into a bad spot because toss was still active and then dying again immediately. While this interaction wasn't new, it started happening more often as both Tiny and Buyback became constants of competitive Dota 2. Personally, I think you could argue skill issue, but Valve decided to help pros out a bit and remove the interaction from the game. Along the way, Tiny's talents were changed to these. While not as strong as before, many of them were still quite excellent. Plus 15% tree grab unit damage bonus enhanced his already powerful attack damage, and 15% status resistance was a fairly significant amount. After some additional minor adjustments to toss and tree grab, Tiny was ready for the International 2021. However, there were also quite a few changes to Dota as a whole that we need to discuss first. In patch 7.23, neutral items were added. Neutral items were items that dropped from neutral creeps in the jungle. They were split into 5 tiers, and each tier became available after a certain amount of in-game time had passed. Neutral items worked just like normal items, as heroes equipped them into their inventory and then gained benefits from them. However, they had a few noteworthy extra rules. They couldn't be sold, and they were fully shareable between teammates. There was no limit on how many neutral items could be dropped, but whenever one did, the chance of the next one decreased. As you might expect, this immediately led to players stacking as many neutral items as they possibly could on their carries. Within a single day, a follow-up patch was released that limited neutral item drops to 3 per tier, and patch 7.24 added a dedicated inventory slot for neutral items, which became the only slot they could occupy, limiting neutral items to 1 per player. Over the next few months, neutral items were refined significantly. Eventually, 5 of them dropped for each tier, 1 for each player. Among the neutral items were 2 that were especially noteworthy for Tiny. The Leveler was an item that provided bonus attack speed, armor, and increased the physical damage a hero did to buildings by 25%. As Tiny already did massive building damage because of tree grab and grow, the Leveler slotted excellently into his inventory and allowed him to demolish bases in seconds. The other item that Tiny cared about was Titan's Sliver. Titan's Sliver provided its carrier with bonus attack damage, status resistance, and magic resistance. What made Titan's Sliver noteworthy was that the bonus damage it added was 20% of the hero's base damage. Grow and his naturally high strength provided Tiny with enormous base damage, and so Titan's Sliver could frequently offer upwards of 70 bonus damage by itself. This was a much higher bonus than neutral items usually provided. Whether or not Tiny managed to get his hands on one of these 2 items could have a significant impact on his performance in the game, which added a level of randomness to the hero as neutral items weren't predictable. If Tiny dropped what he wanted, then that was great news for his team, and if he didn't, there wasn't anything that could be done about it. For some heroes, this would have been considered a downside, but Tiny was still very popular, so for him the randomness of the neutral items was more seen as a random chance that the already strong hero a team picked became even more powerful. Setting neutral items aside, another item that became relevant for Tiny was Silver Edge. Silver Edge was an upgrade for Shadowblade, a simple item that provided damage, attack speed, and an active effect that made its caster invisible for a few seconds. Silver Edge had gone through a lengthy journey ever since its implementation after the International 4. At no point had the item been particularly powerful or relevant, as all of its iterations felt uninspired and lacking in direction. In patch 7.30, Silver Edge was yet again reworked, but this time Valve fully leaned into the attack power-based approach and incorporated Critical Strike into the item. It now provided a fantastic 60 damage, 40 attack speed, and gave a 30% chance to trigger a 160% Critical Strike. It also had an active effect that made its caster invisible for 14 seconds, and if an attack was used to end this invisibility early, then that attack dealt 175 bonus damage, could never miss, was guaranteed a critical strike, and applied a debuff for 4 seconds that disabled passive abilities. Silver Edge had become an incredibly powerful item that saw wide use as the International 10 rolled around. The ranged carry star that relied on Aghanim's Scepter from TI9 was dead. Tree Volley had been nerfed too much to be worth committing into with the same fervor as before. For most heroes, Losing their core strategy to heavy nerfs would have caused a significantly reduced pick rate. But Tiny wasn't most heroes. Yet again, he found an entirely new playstyle and thrived. The International 10 had a strict, farming-centric metagame. The best heroes were those that could win their lane early, had a quick pushing presence to take tier 1 towers to open up more farming space on the map, and who could then use that farming space efficiently to come online in time for Roshan fights. Bonus points for heroes that could break buildings quickly after one fight. Tiny moved to the safe lane as a position 1 carry. His high burst damage, natural tankiness and ease of last hitting made it trivial for him to win his lane. He could adjust his skill build as needed, sometimes maxing out Avalanche first, but usually committing fully into tree grab to maximize his laning presence, early pushing power and jungle farming speed. After winning his lane, Tiny helped his team take down tier 1 towers and then vanished into the jungle, which he cleared with an unmatched speed. Tiny nearly always dominated the net worth charts and was one of the most dependable carries in the game. His item build always followed the same formula, as it was so strong that variation simply wasn't necessary. Power Treads into Echo Saber into Silver Edge, Aghanim's Shard and BKB. An incredibly basic item build centered around attacking power, which Tiny used to absolutely crush anyone that dared step in front of him.
Oh yeah, they're in the RP, and there's the damage follow-up. You swiped, and VP4 Global comes down, skew over from all level, 1293 damage crit there. GPK the only one making it out. But
a few times Tiny had a slower start, he could instead take a more team-centric approach with Blink Dagger, focused around initiating fights and ganks. This wasn't his primary role, but he was still good at it, and that flexibility made him even more desirable. Blink Dagger was generally speaking still a strong option on Tiny and saw frequent use, although if and when it was purchased depended a lot on the game and the specific player. Items were not all that made Tiny powerful. Io was no longer the only one to pay attention to him. Over the past few years, he had made many powerful friends that were happy to support him. Elder Titan protected Tiny and stripped their opponents of their armor, leaving them vulnerable to Tiny's tremendously powerful attacks. And Ogre Magi made Tiny even larger, providing him with valuable bonus attack speed and movement speed. However, Tiny, in particular, made two new great friends: Magnus and Lycan. Magnus was a source of stability for Tiny. Magnus provided allies with a buff that increased their base damage by a percentage, while giving them a powerful cleave that was fantastic for clearing out creep waves. And Tiny was a farming-focused carry that had the highest base damage in the game. Magnus excelled at isolating targets and getting them out of position, and Tiny specialized in quickly bursting down anyone that dared step in front of him by themselves. Magnus had a powerful AoE stun that dragged enemies into a single spot, and Tiny did a devastating amount of cleave damage. A perfect union. Tiny and Magnus complemented each other's strengths and compensated for their weaknesses.
See what they can do. There's the global. He comes out from Dian, they'll see if they can lock down Ori. You got Poyo already coming from the side. Ori's going to be able to get out there. He's down bottom 11 with a 3-man RP. Poyo lays down the damage. Nightfall trying to run. Heal for a 1700 damage hit coming out there to end Nightfall's life. GG called. VG Gaming this first game of the series.
Lycan, on the other hand, brought out Tiny's wild side. He was a core himself, one that played the offlane on the opposite side of the map. There, Lycan applied significant pressure on his opponents and worked his way towards two important core items. First, he got Helm of the Overlord, an upgrade to Vladimir's Offering and Helm of the Dominator. Helm of the Overlord carried the aura of Vladimir's Offering, which, among other bonuses, provided nearby allied heroes with a percentage increase to their base damage and gave them lifesteal. The item also allowed its wielder to take control of a neutral creep, many of which carried powerful auras. Strengthened by these auras, Tiny became an even more overwhelming force than he had already been, but Lycan could push him even further. Lycan's ultimate, Shapeshift, transformed him into a ferocious wolf that had maximum movement speed, was unslowable, and had a 40% chance for a powerful critical strike. Lycan's Aghanim Scepter gave him the ability to bite an ally, which activated Shapeshift on them. A shapeshifted Tiny was unstoppable.
Very good. That's without
Alright, we'll fight double damage. Okay.
Okay, they want to go for
anyone.
a fight. Now he has the Bloodlust applied. Ame. How many shots will it take? He finds Nisha. No, we'll back away for now. Oh my god! Yatsor dead in one shot this time! Nisha, despite having a BKB! Oh my god! Secret are crumbling because Tiny is gigantic! Ame!
In fights, Tiny was a giant. His naturally high strength combined with the bonus armor provided by Grow made him impossible to take on directly, and his easy-to-use disables made escape equally difficult. And once he won a fight, nobody pushed the base quicker than Tiny. Buildings crumbled in front of him as if they were scissors. Towers, barracks, even the Ancient, nothing was safe. The attack damage Tree Grab and Grow provided Tiny were simply too much for most teams to handle. In fact, they were literally too much. Tree Grab had a level 15 talent that increased the damage it provided by 15%. However, Valve had made a mistake while implementing this talent, and instead of a 15% damage boost, it gave Tiny twice that amount, 30% instead of 15. This inaccuracy went entirely unnoticed by casters, analysts, and the majority of the community. Tiny would have been strong even without this accidentally overpowered talent, but with it, he became one of the most powerful heroes of the entire tournament. At the International 10, Tiny was, yet again, amazing. He slotted perfectly into the metagame, both based on what was expected of him and on which heroes he made a strong team with. Carry Tiny was very much the focus of the tournament and was by far his most popular style. Still, mid, offlane and support Tiny always saw some play and performed well. Flexibility or strength. Heroes boasting one of these attributes had always been strong picks, and Tiny had both. At 187 contested matches, over 96% of the tournament, Tiny was the second most popular hero of TI10, trailing Monkey King by only a single game. Out of those 187 games, Tiny only made it past the first stage of the draft 11 times. The International 10 was an incredible tournament for Tiny, and Tiny was an incredible hero for the tournament. Standing on top of the mountain that was competitive Dota 2, Tiny looked around, and to his delight, right beside him stood his best friend Io. After another spectacular year, Tiny was yet again due for significant adjustments. Tree Grab was nerfed again and its broken talent was fixed. Echo Saber was also nerfed and had its cooldown between double strikes increased from 5 seconds to 6. Then in patch 7.31, Grow and Tree Grab received soft reworks. Tree Grab no longer provided a percentage increase to Tiny's damage and instead added a flat 20. It also had its bonus building damage significantly reduced. In turn, Grow now had the bonus damage it passively provided increased by 50% when Tiny was carrying a tree. This change reduced some of Tiny's late game potential, but it also offered him better baseline power for the early game. Tiny's level 15 Tree Grab bonus damage was changed to increase the bonus damage Grow provided by another 50% if Tiny was carrying a tree. Grow also started providing a flat damage boost to Toss, which replaced Toss's 30% bonus damage to the tossed unit. Important here is that the new damage boost no longer required Tiny to toss a specific target. It always applied to all units hit. Toss also had its damage slightly adjusted and its bonus damage multiplier during Avalanche reduced from 2.5 to 2. This all made Toss a more dependable ability by itself, as it now did a lot more damage in most scenarios. Finally, Tree Throw now applied a minor slow. This rework left Tiny in an even stronger state than he had been before. While his peak potential was lessened, He had become much more dependable and needed less items to become powerful. Within days, Valve had to step in and nerf him again. But he was still way too good, and 2 months later, Tiny got nerfed heavily yet again. Tree Grab had its bonus building damage reduced, Grow lost a lot of its tree damage multiplier, and the level 15 bonus damage talent was moved to level 20. The only buff Tiny received was that the tree throw slow now also applied during tree volley. However, even after all those nerfs, Tiny was still too strong, and Valve finally had enough. Toss had its mana cost increased and cast range decreased. The big change, however, was Grow no longer reducing Tiny's attack speed by a flat value and instead by a constant 30%. No matter which items Tiny bought or which buffs were cast on him, he always had 30% less attack speed than other heroes. This was a massive nerf to his carry potential, especially as both Magnus and Lycan also had their buffs nerfed. As a small compensation, Grow had its bonus damage increased. Finally, Tiny had his movement speed nerfed to 285, and then it was time for the next tournament. At the International 11, Tiny's carry build was in the worst shape it had been in years. While his previous attack speed deficits were a downside, it had been possible to make up for them by buying items that provided the missing attack speed. It wasn't unusual for Tiny to be attacking fairly quickly once he made it to the mid to late game stages, and combined with Echo Saber and his massive attack damage, he had been a powerful carry. However, that was before Tiny's attack speed was nerfed by a constant 30%. Now he really struggled to get attacks out quickly, no matter which items he purchased, and even Echo Saber wasn't enough to fix the issue anymore as it had been nerfed significantly. While Tiny's power was still remarkable, having low attack speed at the International 11 was unacceptable as Wave Pact dominated the competition. Wave Pact was an item that only existed for a little over a year, but for that brief moment, it was the most important item in the game. Wave Pact summoned a totem that dealt damage to nearby enemies and reduced all damage they dealt by 30%. A 30% damage reduction was devastating for nearly every hero, and as such the totem needed to be dealt with quickly. The totem could be killed by attacking it 4 times, but it also had the ability to move to try to get out of range of such attacks. Killing the totem quickly was an important aspect of teamfights, and Tiny was terrible at it. Neither tree throw or tree volley could be used to damage the totem, and his low attack speed meant it took him forever to get the required 4 attacks in. Tiny had no good way of dealing with the totem, and as he was a simple character whose primary purpose was to deal damage, he was also heavily impacted by its damage reduction debuff. Wave Pact shut down Tiny, and he had only one option for counterplay, which was staying outside of its radius. Tiny couldn't play the ranged carry style he had used at TI9 either, as Tree Volley wasn't usually powerful enough on its own. Instead, he dug deeper into his pocket full of tricks and found an even older approach. Face Boots, Blink Dagger, Hit and Run Tiny. He played from a distance and always outside of the radius of dangerous effects. Tiny would blink in, get a kill, and then run away until his cooldowns were ready again. Echo Saber remained essential as it gave him the damage he needed to close out combo kills, and if he wasn't relying on sustained damage output, then the cooldown nerf didn't matter that much. From here he could either try to make Tree Volley work or lean into a more tanking focused initiation style for the mid to late game. This style of core Tiny was usually played from the mid. While it was still a powerful build, it was nowhere near the level it had been before and no longer his most common approach. Instead, Support Tiny saw a massive surge in popularity. At the International 11, laning became weird, specifically in the offlane. Offlane cores had shifted to become full-on carry roles, although one important job they retained was fighting for lane control. Lane bodies like Enigma, Broodmother and Beastmaster were perfectly suited for this and saw a ton of play. Still, even with heroes like that, the offlane was hard to play, as the natural position at which the lane creeps clashed favored the safe lane. From the offlane's perspective, the creeps were far away from their towers, which left them exposed. To counteract this, a new strategy emerged. A support would walk behind the enemy tower and pull aggro from the creep wave before they made it into the lane properly. Then they maintained that aggro, usually tanking multiple hits from the creeps and attacks and spells from the opposing heroes, while they walked through the jungle and aimed for one of two spots. They could pull the opposing creep wave right in front of their own tower and have it clash into their allied creep wave there or behind their own tower. The position in front of the tower was more sustainable and allowed for better long-term lane control as the lane bully could keep the opponents away. The position behind the tower usually denied their opponents significant gold and experience as they had a hard time getting close to the creep wave. Not every support could do such creep pulls, as it left them explicitly exposed to attacks from creeps and heroes for a lengthy period of time. Tiny was exceedingly tanky for a support, and Avalanche and Toss were fantastic tools for keeping opponents away. He was a prime candidate for creep pulling, which made him an invaluable asset to any offlane. When he wasn't resetting the lane for his partner, Tiny used the massive 20 bonus damage at level 1 from Tree Grab to easily out-harass most other supports and disrupted his opponent's plays with powerful disables. Tree Grab was getting leveled again, usually once to maximize his laning potential and also the value he got out of Grow. And then as before, Tiny maxed out Avalanche and Toss. Once Tiny had a few levels, he could also start roaming, as he outclassed all other supports' burst damage. He was a support that bullied supports. Due to his naturally high health and armor, Tiny could simply run in and take the hits before comboing somebody. Even if he died, it wasn't that big a deal, since he was just a support and usually helped set up his team for a larger play. However, the full combo being used for a kill was actually fairly unusual, as it often wasn't enough to kill a carry, especially as laning concluded. Toss has always had a lot of utility, but now that Tiny could no longer rely on raw power alone to force a victory, he started exploring all the options Toss gave him. It became much more common for Tiny to use Toss to throw allies towards his opponents to chase them down, or to start a fight, or to throw opponents away from his allies to protect them. The strongest play Tiny could make in most situations was him blinking on top of an opponent, then tossing that opponent to his allies and following up with an avalanche stun to lock them down long enough to secure the kill. In many circumstances, this was a better, more reliable version of Patch's hook, and it made Tiny a deadly presence at any point of the game. This kind of play usually left Tiny in a dangerous position, but as I'm sure you're already tired of hearing, Tiny was tanky. Killing him took so long that by the time he would have died, the opposing team would have been too late to save their teammate. Despite diving in head first, Tiny often managed multiple such initiations per fight, and his item build was centered around allowing for that. Boots, Blink Dagger, Force Staff. As a support, that was all Tiny needed. When he wasn't initiating fights, Tiny also functioned as an incredible bodyguard. TI-11 often had lengthy periods where both teams were focused on farming up their carries, but also actively hoping for an opportunity to catch somebody out that got too greedy. During these moments, Tiny would stay in the vicinity of his position 1 carry and protect them with his life, something he excelled at. Should his carry get attacked, he could blink in, stun the attackers, and either throw his carry to safety or the attackers a distance away. Just like in teamfights, killing Tiny took too long to then also be able to follow up on killing the carry, which meant that whoever Tiny was protecting had an incredible chance at escaping. At the International 11, Tiny took on a new primary style yet again. He became one of the most dependable supports that saw wide usage by nearly every team. Support Tiny was an essential part of the defensive core that helped Tundra hold off Team Secret's Leshrac during the Grand Finals and ultimately helped them win the tournament. Tundra Esports played Tiny the most out of any team, 8 times total, and they won 100% of their games with him. Overall, Tiny was contested in 134 games with a respectable 52% win rate. He was yet again one of the best heroes in the game. For the first 6 years of Dota 2, Tiny was a niche carry with a unique playstyle that revolved around hitting specific timings that most other strategies struggled to fight into. He overwhelmed his opponents early and then transitioned into a powerful mid-game push that ended the game before more standard carries had a chance to come online. This was a powerful strategy and carried Tiny through many games. But unfortunately, it crumbled when faced with common pushing strategies that were even faster and didn't give Tiny the opportunities he needed. But when Tiny was paired with Io and played in a game that didn't involve rapid pushing, then he was a perfectly viable choice. He was by no means a top-tier character, but he more than held his own. Tiny's biggest problem was that he essentially only had 3 abilities, as Craggy Exterior was bad. While it was possible to play heroes with only 3 abilities during the early years, post 7.0 power creep had become too much for that to still be an option. After Tiny went unpicked at the most balanced international of all time, Valve removed Craggy Exterior and replaced it with one of the best abilities to ever be added: Tree Grab. Immediately, Tiny shot to the top of the leaderboards and became a staple of the competitive scene. Every year, he brought new innovations and strategies, and he always performed excellently. Whether that be as an imposing ganker at TI8, a destructive range carry at TI9, an unstoppable melee carry at TI10, or a versatile support at TI11, Tiny always found a way to make himself relevant and impactful. I find the question of how good was Tiny incredibly difficult to answer. For the first 7 years, he was fine, but not outstanding. However, after his rework, Tiny was nothing but one of the best heroes in the game for 4 years straight, and it isn't looking like he's slowing down. He may or may not be one of the greatest of all time, but he certainly is the best of the modern era. A true giant. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to become a channel member. Do all of the good stuff. And of course, if you did enjoy it, please also let us know what video you would like to see next, what hero you want us to make a story of Dota about. Now, I have to say, Tiny is a bit of a favorite of mine, so I just kind of said, alright, let's tackle the big boy right away. And I'm honestly really happy with how the video turned out. I'm really happy with how his storyline turned out. It kind of blew my mind to see him shift so much every year and still stay so incredibly powerful. Isn't that fascinating? That's so neat. Although unfortunately, he didn't do so well at TI12, but I didn't know that while we were making that video. So in case you're wondering how he performed at TI12, he was fine. He was a fine support, not really a good mid. It's really not that strong there, but his overall pick rate was fairly low. So kind of his worst modern tournament so far, but that's okay, because the previous years were fantastic and a lot of fun. So thank you very much for watching the video, and I'll see you for the next one, which is going to be Meatball. Until then.